Friends, welcome to another episode of the Bible Book by Book. In this episode, I want us to explore something around bread for a moment. Now, God, we're told, leads his people out of slavery into the desert. And in the desert, they're thirsty and they're hungry. We're told they're starving. And God provides for them. And you may remember in the bit of the story, the people of God, they walk out of their tents one day. And on the floor, laying on the grass, was bread. This is represented by bread. Actually, it's biscotti, which is not bread at all, but it kind of looks bread-like. And they would come out, and there was this bread on the floor. And it says in the passage that they looked at it and said, "What is it?" Well, actually, in the Hebrew, we're told they called it manna. It's manna. Manna literally translates as, it's like, what's that? The word manna is more of a facial expression and than it is a word. But they walked out their tent and went, and the Bible says they called it manna. And this idea kind of developed that God provided bread from heaven. That God is the God of provision. When you're in the darkest moments, when you're your deepest need, God will provide. So this idea kind of was around that God provided bread. We then have a story that we find in 2 Samuel chapter 6. King David is just dancing into Jerusalem with the Ark of the Covenant behind him, and he's declaring God's presence coming back into the city of Jerusalem. And at the end of him dancing into the city, it says that he took bread and he provided bread for the people in the city. He says it gave them cakes with rice in, bread cakes with rice in, and with fruit in. And he hands them out because God is a God of provision, and David represents God. So David representing God is providing for his people by giving bread. And this idea developed that the Messiah, when the Messiah came, he would provide bread from heaven like God had done before, like King David had done before. You then get King Herod, the king around the time of Jesus. And the history books tell us this. King Herod was so desperate to be the Messiah, he did everything he could to try and fulfill what the Jews were looking for in a Messiah. And we're told that what Herod would do, he would have his people bake bread, and when there were times when people were questioning him as king, he would bake bread, he would put it on the back of a cart, and he and his people would take it out and they would provide it and hand it out in Jerusalem. We're told that they were quite selective sometimes over who they handed it to. But what he was trying to say was, I am the provider. If David was the perfect king, provided bread from heaven, like God had done during the time that they were wandering in the desert, then King Herod is saying, I am him. I am the one who provides bread from heaven too. Now it's interesting. People were saying, well, is he the Messiah or is he not? And it's at the same time that we have Jesus. And the Gospels set themselves up to ask this question, who is the real king? And the Gospel of Matthew particularly plays on this idea that there's 2 kings in town, which is going to be the real king, which is the king that's going to be the Messiah. And we've just got this little passage from John chapter 6, verse 35. And this makes a little bit more sense now, just knowing what Herod was playing out, what had happened with David and what had happened with God in the wilderness. So John chapter 6, verse 35, it says this, "Then Jesus declares, I am the bread of life, and he who comes to me will never go hungry, and he who believes in me will never go thirsty." Herod hands out bread that once you've eaten it, it is gone. David hands out bread, once you've eaten it, it is gone. And Jesus says, I am the bread of life. If you take from me, then I will provide for you. In this line, Jesus is doing 2 things. First, he's saying, I'm the real king. Herod, you're wandering around, you're handing out bread out, trying to be the Messiah. Forget it. I am the real king. I am the bread of life. That beginning of the sentence, I am the bread of life, that I am takes us back to God speaking to Moses at the burning bush. And Moses says to God, what's your name? When I go and talk to people about you, how do I declare who you are? And God says, I am that I am. In other words, I exist. I am. That was his name. So when Jesus says, I am, he's harking back to the burning bush, the bread of life. He's the one who provided in the wilderness with the manna on the floor. He is the one that David was representing. And actually, Herod didn't realise it, but he was mimicking Jesus all along. And I suppose one of the questions that we could learn from this is, where does our culture around us try to mimic God, but yet isn't God? Where is our culture trying to mimic what God does, but doesn't do it right or properly or wholesomely and give us the fullness of life, but yet Jesus is the thing that embodies all of that. Jesus says, I am the bread of life. I hope you found that interesting. Grace and peace.